He didn't just have our back figuratively, he had it literally. He was out there with us on every single congressional recess. All three of them were, and we experienced some very wonderful moments and some pretty low moments as well. You know, there's a saying in Washington, if you want a friend, get a dog. I think I used to say, if you want a real friend, get John McCain. And by the way, he also brings the dog.
He brings the dogs, he brings the bats. If you've been to Sedona, there are all sorts of critters there. And I want to talk to you more about, I want to know, I want to understand from you if the surge would have happened, which sort of indisputable now that turned the war around. But it wasn't a short thing that it would get this support. So I want to talk to you about that more. But I want to play Senator McConnell, who was just on the floor a moment ago, and Eddie Glad. I want your thoughts on what we're seeing in Congress today.
I think it's fair to say the passion that John brought to his work was unsurpassed in this body. In more than 30 years as a senator, he never failed to marshal a razor-sharp wit, a big heart, and, of course, a fiery spirit. When John saw an issue the same way you did, you knew you had just found your most stalwart ally. You would thank your lucky stars. Because when you found yourself on the other side of that table, as I think all of us learned, you were in for a different kind of unforgettable experience. Either way, serving alongside John was never a dull affair.
I will add that working for John McCain was never dull, and the treat in that was that you always knew where you stood. You were never going to walk out of his suite and worry that he was going to roll his eyes to some other staffer and say, like, oh, she's such a dope. You know, he gave it to you straight. He gave it to you right away. Usually he called you right on your cell phone before you had a minute to, you know, and he was on all of our cell phones. I mean, he was so present. He was so in touch. There was such an intimacy when you were in John McCain's inner circle.
You know, I've been thinking about this for a while since the announcement of his death. And there, you know, I disagreed with almost every bit of John McCain's politics. But I found him a principled politician, a principled statesman. And I think a lot of the grief in the country today around Senator McCain's death stands as a proxy of what we actually want and desire. So John McCain's career, over and against the reality of the petty small man who occupies the White House. So the grief is actually layered with a longing that something has disappeared, that something we need, that we're losing giants and we're replacing them with small men and women, selfish, greedy, self-absorbed people. So even though I disagree with him probably on everything, I recognize something that's lost, something that has been irrevocably lost in our politics. And it reminded me of Emerson's 1850 Representative Men. And Emerson in Representative Men, he lauds all of these great people, and he gives them up as examples of who they are and what they contributed. But what's important about them is that they reveal something in us. Great men and women make even greater men and women possible. So as we long and we grieve, we're actually wondering whether or not the kind of man that Senator McCain was is possible now in the age of Trump.
It's such a good point. He was also the kind of man who could admit when he'd screwed up.
Oh,
and
yeah.
let me tell you something. That is a rare gem. That is a unicorn in American politics. You know, and it makes what happened today with lowering the flags again all the more extraordinary. Let's listen to John McCain with Chris Wallace talking about a mistake he made.
When I do things for political expediency, which I have from time to time, it's always turned out poorly.
Give me an example since you bring it up. What have you done? What would you admit you did for political expediency?
I went down to South Carolina and said that the flag that was flying over the state capitol, which was a Confederate flag, was that I shouldn't be involved in it. It was a state issue. It was an act of cowardice.
Act of cowardice on your part?
Yes.
And you did it because you thought, this will help me in the South Carolina primary in 2000?
Yeah, sure. This won't alienate certain voting bloc. And I lost anyway.
Ashley Parker, I want to get you in on this because it seems to me that there must be something unrecognizable about John McCain to Donald Trump. The two men, it's not just that they spar, it's that there's something, the patriotism that John McCain practiced is unrecognizable in Donald Trump and Trumpism.
That's exactly right. It's not just this ongoing feud between the two men that has sort of led to this point of bad blood, but it's twofold. One is that President Trump can't stand not being the center of attention, can't stand not being, the center of adulation, and the other is that many of these traits that are being now lauded and celebrated and touted in Senator John McCain are traits that President Trump notably often does not exhibit. And so it's even in that silence, it's a very pointed contrast and one that is not particularly flattering to this president. And so this whole week is going to be very difficult for him, frankly. We've seen it in his behavior so far. And if I were a betting person and covering President Trump, I am not a betting person, but I would bet that we would see a bit of it going forward over all of these funerals and these memorials and this celebration of Senator McCain's life.
If you bet, I'm going to bet with you because you're as good of a Trump watcher as anybody. General Petraeus, I want to ask you, just to pull this thread that Ashley raises, the reason it's difficult for him, I believe, is that Donald Trump doesn't recognize what animates John McCain because there's no capacity to relate to it. I mean, John McCain is someone, as you said at the top of the show, who would rather lose an election than lose a war. Donald Trump is someone who is at open war with the intelligence community. He just stripped the security clearance from John Brennan. I know you signed a letter in defense of John Brennan. How dangerous is the treading on national security for an American president right now?
Well, it's concerning, but I would point out, I think, that the institutions are very strong and very robust.
Really, Rod Rosenstein doesn't know if he has a job from
well,
day to day.
You may look at the Department of Justice differently, but the institutions with which I have experience, the military and the intelligence community, very professional. And there are obviously no political appointees in the military ranks. Obviously, there are in the Secretary of Defense office and so forth. But in the intelligence community, in the CIA, there's only one political appointee who matters, the director of the CIA, who right now is a professional. These are organizations that keep their head down, that tell truth to power, that are not going to shrink from that, but they're going to keep on doing their job. And I have enormous confidence in each of those institutions. Again, I'll leave it to others when it comes to the Department of Justice and the challenges that they face right now.
Far be it from me to question your assessment, but does it give you any pause to see people who are as familiar as you are with those agencies, like General Hayden, like John Brennan, like George Tenet, who also signed that letter, really sounding the alarm and feeling that it is almost un-American to have a president disparage some of those institutions that have always sort of been on the other side of the red line of political discourse? Well,
we signed the letter, and it should be read very carefully because a number of us, George and I and others, have not been ones who have been out on domestic issues, that we tend to focus on the areas that we know. And what struck us in this case, and what galvanized all of us, was that a seeming attempt to, number one, to stifle the freedom of speech. You know, I was criticized very, very many times in uniform and so forth. And after one particular case where a full-page ad was taken out against me on the big day of the biggest testimony ever, the 6-month mark of the surge, the next day I was asked how I felt about that, and I said, you know, I feel very proud to have defended the right of others to exercise free speech, even if it means criticizing me. I obviously didn't applaud it. But again, and that's the way I feel about it in general, and it's that someone would seem to want to impede that or to intimidate others. That was what bothered us, and that's what led us to do that. Again, whether or not all the signers agreed with what John Brennan has said or the profile or what have you, in fact, it said dash dash and not all do, we all were united in that particular issue. And that's, I think, what really mattered there. Again, though, I had 37 years in one of them and then was the head of the other. I think these institutions are very, very strong. And I think they will very much endure.
I want to just tell our viewers, I remember that day. There was an ad, I believe it was paid for by MoveOn.org.
Yes,
they called you General Betray Us. It was 2006, is that right?
2007, it was the 6-month mark of the surge. Ambassador Crocker and I were in Washington that day. We were going to testify before the House and armed services and foreign relations committees.
I guess the distinction I would draw between that, which was inexcusable, I believe I was in the White House at the time, and I remember that. It was that at the time crossed a red line, is that the attacks now are coming from an American president. Is there anything in the attacks on the Justice? General Hayden calls them the evidence-based science.